In this video, we're going to discuss 4 qualitative research designs that are commonly used in education research. And the 4 designs are narrative, case study, ethnography, and grounded theory. And these different designs can be distinguished from each other by examining the phenomenon of interest, the intent or the purpose that the researcher states, and also by looking at the procedures that were used in data collection, analysis, and interpretation. There's another research approach that we will also discuss in this course, which is the action research approach, which we are not going to cover in these slides. So how do you recognize the research design in a qualitative research report? Now, it may surprise you that researchers don't always explicitly state a design when they write up their reports. So sometimes you're going to be in a position where you need to identify the design yourself. Obviously, it's easiest for you if the author does name the design in the title or the abstract of the report. But otherwise, you're going to have to look through the purpose statement, the methods section, and the results or findings to pick out those signposts we just discussed and determine for yourself what design they were trying to use. In narrative research, the researcher collects and retells people's stories. They may collect a variety of artifacts beyond simple interviews to document what an individual went through and their context, and then they synthesize that information into a story. Findings from a narrative study will often take the form of a chronological retelling of the participant's story, or perhaps the story of a community, with a description of the context and an identification of themes that emerged as they analyzed various data sources. Here is an example of a narrative research report. This work is by Craig, and the title is Coming to Know in the Eye of a Storm, a beginning teacher's introduction to different versions of teacher community. And we can pick out some key features just by looking at the title and the abstract. First, we can see that the researcher uses a quote, which presumably comes from this beginning teacher, to explain a main takeaway from their work. They contextualize the teacher's experience by explaining that they're a beginning teacher and they're teaching it in one of America's diverse urban campuses. They also highlight themes that emerged in their analysis. So here, 3 themes of global significance emerge, and they quickly describe those themes. If you want to check out this research, you can follow this link below. The next approach we're going to look at is the case study approach. And case study researchers are often a bit eclectic in the methodologies that they use and the data sources they collect. So you may see case studies that are developed in an ethnographic style, for example. But in general, case studies are set apart by their in-depth exploration of some bounded system. And what does that mean? Well, it could mean that you are looking at multiple individuals who are using one tool, or one individual in a particular situation. You could be looking at the activities of one organization, or you could be looking at multiple organizations taking part in one program. So how the researcher defines the boundaries of what a case is something that you should look out for when you're reading these studies, because they need to very carefully state what is in and what is out of scope. Cases may be selected because they are notable in and of themselves, but they're often selected to illustrate a specific issue, to explain what is typical or atypical, and that sort of thing. These are often drawn from many data sources. For example, a combination of interviews and documents and observation. In an organizational setting, you might see, especially in the instructional design work. And the researcher's job is to develop a deep description of the scenario and identify themes, and in practical case studies also to report on lessons learned from the experience. So when we look at the findings from case studies, we're going to expect to see a deep description of each case, themes that emerged, and if multiple cases were studied, then we would want to look for discussion of comparisons across cases, which of course may mean different sites, different organizations. So here is an example of a case study. This is work by Watson et al. A case study of the in-class use of a video game for teaching high school history. So what are the boundaries on this? Well, it sounds like the phenomenon of interest was using this particular video game, making history, in a high school classroom, specifically to teach about World War II. And we are given some context about who the participants were. They're high school sophomores, they're at a rural school in the Midwest of the US. And we can see also that they used multiple data sources to develop their analysis. So here we see observation, focus group, interviews, and document analysis. We also get a sense of how the students were expected to play. So we're told that the teacher was experienced with teaching with this game, that the subject matter had already been introduced, and then that they played in class for 3 days of that week. They tell us the purpose of the study, and they are explicitly looking to express both the teacher and student perspectives on their experiences using this game. They give a quick summary of the results, and they also suggest that they will talk about some practical strategies that the teacher evolved through this experience. Next up is the ethnographic research approach. And as we've discussed before, this is drawn from a long tradition of research in sociology and anthropology, looking at cultural phenomena, looking at beliefs, practices, language, and activities that are found within a group that shares some culture. And it's from this tradition of research that many of the considerations and the cautions that we have about researcher reflexivity and researcher influence on the participants that they observe, this is where they come from. Because an ethnographer tends to embed themselves in the community context, they may actually take part in the practices, or they may sort of step back and simply observe. But because they are there, they may be influencing the types of interactions that go on in that community. So this approach has a great influence over qualitative work in general, and you may see certain ethnographic ideals or techniques appearing within the context of other types of qualitative research. And you'll see this in the language that the researchers use to discuss their work and to discuss their own roles in that work. Typically, ethnographers will collect multiple sources of data, but often they rely heavily on field work. The ethnographer will develop a detailed description of how members of this cultural group behave, how they think, how they speak, and also contextualize that and describe the context or setting where they've seen the group or where that group lives. Here's an example of an ethnographic study. An ethnographic case study of beliefs, context factors, and practices of teachers integrating technology. So here's an example where the ethnographic approach was used within a case study to develop a case study. And looking through the abstract, we can see right up front that they were interested in beliefs, in practices, and also contextual factors influencing how 3 middle school teachers were developing their technology-enriched curricula. And their findings directly follow from this purpose. So they discuss beliefs about technology, they discuss things that the teachers had to do to prepare, they discuss the types of support they had in their school environment, and they talk about the teacher's perspective in depth. And we can't tell, of course, from this short description how the researchers interacted with the teachers or what sorts of data they collected. But if you want to learn more about that, you can visit the link below and have a look for yourself. The final approach I'm going to discuss today is grounded theory. And grounded theory is a pretty important and influential approach in qualitative work. And it's often used by beginning researchers because it's a fairly structured process. And it's also often used to study phenomena that are not well characterized yet, where there is not necessarily a well-supported framework through which to approach that situation. So grounded theory researchers stay very close to the data. They collect a lot of it and carefully review it on an ongoing basis, developing codes and categories that they use to identify attributes that could play a part in a conceptual model. And that's really the main deliverable of this sort of project, is to develop some sort of model that could then be applied and validated through further research. This type of work is usually applied when there's a need to describe a process, action, or an interaction. And multiple sources of data are used. In the book, they emphasize interview data, but often other sorts of data are collected as well to provide triangulation. And the grounded theory approach involves an iterative coding process where they flow from open coding, where they just try to code everything they can see, not necessarily sticking to pre-existing categories that they've seen elsewhere. Axial coding then drills down deeper. You find some category from the first pass that seems really important or core to the process of interest, and then try to relate it to the other categories that have emerged. And finally, third pass is used to develop propositions or hypotheses. This could be identifying possible relationships between attributes that have been identified that can then be realized in a sort of conceptual model, and perhaps a set of predictions about how these different ideas are related to each other. So the deliverable from a grounded theory study will typically involve the presentation of a theory with some discussion of how these different categories or themes relate to each other, and again, possible predictions that are suggested by this work. So here's an example of a grounded theory study. This is by Hindle, and Hindle presents a grounded theory for teaching entrepreneurship using simulation games. So you can see that the process of interest here was teaching entrepreneurship with simulation games. And you can see that Hindle describes this as a case study. And this is a very practice-focused grounded theory. You see that the students' views were actually assessed using written submissions rather than interviews. And we'd have to read the full study to get a sense of whether or not the researcher tried to validate that written work through some other means, for example, by interviewing individual students or using observations from the teacher. We can't really tell what other information may have been drawn into developing the categories that they present, but we can see that the findings from this study are presented as a theory that involves 4 categories and also some predictions about what properties are required from a simulation game to make it an effective teaching device in this context. So that's everything for this discussion of 4 common qualitative research designs, and I hope that this video was helpful to you.